In the autumn of 1942, the average life expectancy of a Soviet Red Army soldier in this city was only 24 hours. For an officer, it lasted barely 3 more days. The sky was no longer blue. It was suffocated by ash, gun smoke, and gigantic fires that never stopped burning. The ground was no longer earth, but a chaotic wasteland of shattered bricks, twisted steel, blood and frozen corpses. In this deepest circle of hell on earth, men no longer fought for a stretch of land or a hill. They fought for every basement, every staircase, every square meter of ruined floor. Welcome to Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, the Nazi war machine appeared unstoppable. After being halted outside Moscow during the previous winter, Adolf Hitler sought a decisive blow that would completely crush the will of the Soviet Union. Operation Blau was launched. Its original objective was practical: seize the rich oil fields of the Caucasus, the lifeblood fuel needed to sustain the Third Reich's massive mechanized armies. But when Hitler looked at the map, his eyes stopped on a single point along the banks of the Volga River. An industrial city stretching nearly 30 kilometers, bearing the name of his greatest enemy, Stalingrad. Capturing the city would not only sever the Soviet Union's vital river transport route from the south to the heartland, but also deliver a devastating psychological blow. It was a propaganda prize Hitler simply could not resist. The spearhead of the assault was entrusted to the German Sixth Army, the most elite and powerful force in the Wehrmacht, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus. Paulus was a brilliant staff officer, a meticulous planner whose uniforms were always perfectly pressed, and whose white gloves remained spotless. Yet he lacked real combat experience in the brutal, unforgiving conditions that demanded ruthlessness and flexibility. He commanded over 300,000 elite troops, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, advancing eastward with absolute confidence in a swift victory. On the other side, the Soviet Red Army was in a state of desperation. Millions had already been lost since the beginning of the war. Retreat had become almost instinctive. Furious at the collapse of his armies, Joseph Stalin issued the infamous Order No. 227 with the slogan, "Not one step back." Anyone abandoning their position would be branded a traitor and face execution by their own side. To defend Stalingrad, Stalin appointed General Vasily Zhukov to command the 62nd Army. In complete contrast to Paulus, Zhukov was a man of the trenches, hard, rough, ruthless and practical. He understood that Soviet infantry could never defeat German tanks and aircraft in open battle. He declared, "We will defend this city or die within it." On August 23, 1942, hell descended upon the people of Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet under Wolfram von Richthofen launched one of the most devastating carpet bombings in the history of warfare. More than 1,000 bombers roared across the sky, unleashing thousands of tons of explosives and incendiaries. Within days, over 40,000 civilians were crushed beneath collapsing ruins. The city, once the industrial pride of the Soviet Union, became a burning slaughterhouse. The fires grew so intense that they created gigantic firestorms, consuming everything in their path. The Volga River itself, the Red Army's only supply line, burned with oil spilling from destroyed storage tanks. Yet this destruction became one of Germany's greatest tactical mistakes. By flattening the city, the Luftwaffe unintentionally created the perfect defensive fortress for the Soviets. Collapsed, reinforced concrete buildings formed massive obstacles that German panzer tanks could not overcome. The mechanized warfare the Wehrmacht prided itself on was rendered useless. Instead, the battle devolved into what German soldiers came to hatefully call Rattenkrieg, Rat War. When German infantry entered the city in September 1942, they quickly realized every rule of warfare they had learned no longer applied. The battle was no longer measured in kilometers, but in individual rooms. Zhukov devised a brutal and brilliant tactic known as hugging the enemy. Soviet troops were ordered to stay within 50 meters of German positions, close enough for a grenade throw. This neutralized German air power and artillery, because any bombardment risked killing their own soldiers. Germans and Soviets occupied the same apartment blocks simultaneously. Germans on the second floor, Soviets on the third, shooting at each other through holes blasted in the ceilings. The battlefield became a maze of underground tunnels, sewers, and ruined factories. Massive industrial complexes such as the Red October Steel Factory, the Barricade Weapons Plant, and the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory turned into impregnable fortresses. Fighting became so intense that workers continued assembling T-34 tanks at one end of a factory, while German troops stormed the other. Tanks rolled straight off the production line and into battle, sometimes without even being painted. The bloodiest fighting centered on Mamayev Kurgan, the highest point in the city. Whoever controlled the hill could dominate Stalingrad with artillery fire. The earth itself was churned apart by millions of shells. The hill changed hands 14 times in just a few weeks. Entire Soviet battalions crossing the Volga to reinforce the position were annihilated within hours. Corpses piled upon one another, forming barriers behind which the living sought cover. The bombardment was so intense that by the following spring, not a single blade of grass could grow on Mamayev Kurgan. This was no longer merely a battle, it was the ultimate test of human endurance and psychology. In the dark ruins filled with brick dust and the stench of rotting bodies, the most effective weapons were no longer tanks or artillery, but PPSH-41 submachine guns, grenades, knives, and sharpened entrenching shovels. Soviet soldiers crawled through sewers, emerged behind German lines, slit throats, and vanished back into the darkness. Fear haunted every German soldier whenever he turned a corner, opened a door, or simply tried to sleep. And from the ruins emerged one of Stalingrad's deadliest specters: the snipers. Hidden within shattered buildings, hunters like Vasily Zaitsev transformed the city into a killing ground. One dry crack from an unseen position, and another German officer collapsed dead. This psychological warfare shattered German nerves. Soldiers could neither sleep nor move without feeling that a rifle barrel was aimed directly at their heads. The morale of the mighty Sixth Army began to fracture beneath the suffocating atmosphere of blood, dust, and endless screaming. At one intersection, a Soviet squad led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov seized a 4-story apartment building overlooking a square on September 27th. History would remember it as Pavlov's house. For 58 days and nights, fewer than 30 Soviet soldiers armed with machine guns, anti-tank rifles, and mortars held off countless German infantry and armored assaults. They laid mines around the building, punched holes through walls for communication and firing positions, and turned the structure into a fortress. Chuikov later mocked that the Germans lost more men trying to capture Pavlov's house than they had during the entire conquest of Paris. By November 1942, the Germans had pushed the Soviets to the brink of destruction. Chuikov's 62nd Army had been fragmented into isolated pockets of resistance, trapped along the western bank of the Volga, in some places only a few hundred meters from the river itself. Paulus believed victory was finally within his grasp. German propaganda broadcasts in Berlin even claimed Stalingrad had fallen. But the Germans had no idea they were walking directly into one of the greatest strategic traps in military history. While Chuikov used the blood of his soldiers to pin down the entire German Sixth Army within the ruins, the Soviet High Command under Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky secretly prepared a massive counteroffensive known as Operation Uranus. Zhukov identified a fatal weakness in the German deployment. To concentrate forces on the city itself, Paulus had entrusted the defense of his northern and southern flanks to Axis allies, Romanian, Hungarian and Italian troops. These armies were poorly equipped, badly motivated, lacked sufficient artillery, and possessed almost no effective anti-tank weapons capable of stopping Soviet T-34s. Beneath thick fog, elaborate camouflage, and the silence of the approaching winter, the Soviets secretly assembled an enormous force directly under German noses. Over 1.1 million soldiers, nearly 9,000 artillery pieces, 1,436 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft prepared to crush the enemy. On the morning of November 19, 1942, everything changed. Through the freezing mist of the steppe, nearly 9,000 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously. The earth shook like an earthquake. Romania's Third Army on the northern flank was torn apart beneath the storm of steel. Their defenses collapsed within hours. The next day, Soviet forces struck the southern flank, smashing Romania's Fourth Army as well. Massive Soviet armored spearheads surged across the snow-covered plains, forming two gigantic pincers racing toward the town of Kalach west of Stalingrad. On November 23rd, the pincers met at Kalach. The trap had closed. More than 250,000 German, Romanian and Axis troops were completely encircled inside what became known as the Kessel, the Cauldron. Paulus and his once proud army had transformed overnight from hunters into trapped prey. When Paulus received the news, he requested permission to break out and reconnect with German lines. But Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, arrogantly assured Hitler that German air power could supply the trapped army by air. Göring promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies per day. Believing this fantasy, Hitler forbade retreat and ordered the Sixth Army to hold its ground at all costs. It was effectively a death sentence for Germany's greatest army. The Luftwaffe airlift collapsed disastrously. Under heavy Soviet anti-aircraft fire, relentless fighter attacks and the brutal Russian winter storms, German transport aircraft were shot down in large numbers. Instead of 500 tons per day, they delivered barely 100 on average. Some days, as little as 10. Food disappeared, ammunition ran low, and temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Inside the cauldron, the situation descended into unimaginable misery. The army that had once marched triumphantly across Europe became a mass of starving frozen specters, wrapped in thin summer uniforms. Soldiers scavenged through garbage, ate frozen horse carcasses, and even consumed rats. Typhus, dysentery, and frostbite spread everywhere. Thousands froze to death in their sleep. Field hospitals echoed with the screams of soldiers having gangrenous limbs amputated without anesthesia or proper bandages. Abandoned and forgotten beneath the snow, many German soldiers eventually took their own lives to escape the suffering. In December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm in a desperate attempt to relieve the encircled army. His armored spearheads advanced to within 50 kilometers of the pocket. Paulus's soldiers could reportedly see the flashes of rescue artillery on the horizon, yet Hitler still refused to allow a breakout. Soviet counterattacks soon forced Manstein to retreat, extinguishing the final hope of the Sixth Army forever. By January 1943, the Soviets launched Operation Ring to destroy the trapped Germans completely. Compressed into an ever-shrinking pocket and almost out of ammunition, the Germans were slaughtered relentlessly. They lost their final airfields, ending all supply flights and evacuations. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Hitler made one final desperate gesture. He promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. No German Field Marshal in history had ever surrendered or been captured alive. The message was unmistakable. Paulus was expected to commit suicide. But Paulus, witnessing the agony of his men and having completely lost faith in Hitler, chose another path. On January 31st, 1943, deep inside a filthy basement beneath the ruined Univermog department store, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus and his staff formally surrendered to the Soviet army. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the final German resistance in northern Stalingrad laid down its weapons. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. A terrifying silence settled over the ruins. The price of the battle defied imagination. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers and civilians were killed, wounded or missing defending the city. The Axis power suffered roughly 850,000 casualties, including the complete destruction of the Sixth Army, with nearly 300,000 men erased from the battlefield. Of the 91,000 starving German soldiers captured alive, only about 5,000 would ever return home after years in Soviet labor camps in Siberia. Total casualties on both sides exceeded 2 million, making Stalingrad the bloodiest battle in human history. But Stalingrad was more than a military victory. It shattered forever the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. In the ruins beside the Volga, the backbone of Nazi Germany's military power was broken, and the course of World War II changed permanently. For the first time, Germany entered 3 days of national mourning. For the first time, the funeral bells of the Third Reich began to ring. From that moment onward, Nazi Germany would never again regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. Instead, it began a long, bloody retreat, a road that ultimately led straight to Hitler's bunker in Berlin. The shockwaves of Stalingrad echoed across the world, rekindling hope for humanity in the darkest age of fascism. Beneath the ashes of the city bearing Stalin's name, a new world order began to emerge.